The soap smell clung to her hands, even after she had rinsed them twice at the pump. Cecily Barrow stood in the passage between the laundry and the butler's pantry, her borrowed dress too short at the hem and smelling of starch, her own good wool folded at the bottom of the linen basket where she had hidden it before dawn. The dress hung from her shoulders like something apologetic, like something that had already surrendered. She had worn it deliberately. She had heard, 3 days earlier, that the Ashmore family held its informal councils in the butler's pantry on Wednesday mornings, when Mr. Parrish, the butler, was at market, and the cook was below in the kitchen with her door closed. The housekeeper, Mrs. Guff, took her keys to the still room, and the family, unwitnessed and unhurried, said what they would never say in a drawing room. Cecily's father had been dead for 31 days. The letters had begun arriving on the 32nd. She pressed her back against the stones of the passage wall and listened. The pantry door stood 4 inches open, propped by a wedge of folded paper somebody had long ago forgotten to remove. Through that gap came voices, Lady Ashmore first, her syllables clipped and certain, the voice of a woman who had never once been wrong in her own hearing. Then her elder son, Mr. Gerald Ashmore, who had his mother's certainty without his mother's intelligence, and used his voice to fill the space his thinking could not occupy. And last, quieter, a third voice she had not expected. The Earl of Torver. She had seen him once, from the upper landing, on the morning she arrived at Ashmore Park as the late Miss Barrow's companion and secretary, a position arranged in a letter by her father's solicitor 2 weeks before her father died, and confirmed, uncomfortably, by Lady Ashmore in a 10-minute interview during which Cecily had not been invited to sit. He was tall in a way that took up air rather than space, and he stood still in a manner that made other men in a room look as though they were always slightly hurrying. She had noticed the set of his jaw before she noticed anything else about him, the quality of a face that had made a decision it did not intend to revisit. She had thought him formidable, and had thought nothing further, because she had not had the leisure. Now she heard him speak, and she understood that something had gone very wrong. The deed, Lady Ashmore was saying, was registered before my late husband's final illness, and I will not have it inspected by anyone outside this family until I have spoken with Hartley. The solicitor will do as he is told. Hartley is not your solicitor, Lord Torver said. His voice was level, not cold precisely, but absent of accommodation, the way a stone wall is not cold, but simply there. He is the executor of Mr. Barrow's estate. His obligation is to Mr. Barrow's heirs, not to you. Barrow had one heir, Gerald Ashmore said. A daughter, a young woman in our employ, hardly in a position to engage in dispute with this family. The silence that followed was brief and deliberate. You may leave that assessment to her, Lord Torver said. Cecily did not breathe. The starch from the collar of the borrowed dress was pressing against her throat, and she thought, with the particular clarity that fear produces in a careful mind, that she had come here to hear something she already partly knew, and that she was hearing it, and that it was worse than she had constructed it. Her father's land was small, 412 acres in Westmoreland, enough to produce a modest income and the sense of security that comes from owning the ground beneath one's feet. He had spoken of it often in his last weeks, those brief, clear intervals between the laudanum, and always with the same cadence, as though he were rehearsing a recitation he intended to give his solicitor. The land is Cecily's. Whatever else is uncertain, the land is hers. Her father had repeated it like a man who suspected a contrary argument was being prepared, which, as it happened, it was. She had found, on the desk in the library at Ashmore Park 3 days ago, a document she was not meant to see. She had been retrieving a Morocco-bound copy of Burke's Peerage that Lady Ashmore had sent her to find, and the document had been lying open beside it, as though someone had set it down, meaning to return in a moment. The name at the top of the second page was her father's. The signature at the bottom was not quite right. She had not touched it. She had taken the peerage and gone upstairs and folded the knowledge flat inside herself, the way she had learned to fold everything her situation required her to contain. 3 days later, she had put on the laundress's dress. She listened. Lord Torver was speaking again, and his voice had not changed its register, which meant, she realized, that it never changed its register, that whatever he felt or did not feel existed at some distance from the surface of him that the surface declined to report. The document Miss Barrow should have received from her father's estate is her own inheritance. If it has been withheld, misdirected, or altered, that is a matter for the Lord Chancellor's Court, not for your solicitor. You have no standing here, Lady Ashmore said. You are here as a guest. I am here, Lord Torver said, because the late Mr. Barrow was my father's steward for 14 years, and because his daughter is owed the protection of my house if she cannot claim the protection of her own. She cannot, at present, claim the protection of her own. I intend to correct that. There was a sound, low and clipped, from Gerald Ashmore, something that was not quite a word. The girl knows nothing, Lady Ashmore said, and her voice had descended to a register Cecily recognized, the voice one uses when one is most certain and most dangerous. She is a companion. She is clever enough to read ledgers and dull enough to stay in the rooms she is assigned. She will not make difficulty. Lord Torver did not answer immediately. When he spoke, it was without particular emphasis, which made it worse. I think you may have underestimated Miss Barrow, he said. Cecily stepped back from the door. She moved without sound, back along the passage, around the corner, through the servants' stair, and up to the small room on the 3rd floor that Lady Ashmore had assigned her. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed, with her hands folded in her lap, and her borrowed dress still smelling of starch, and thought with the careful, methodical attention of a woman who has been trained since girlhood to think clearly under pressure, because the pressure had never, not once, entirely lifted. She was 23 years old. Her mother had died when she was 7. She had been educated by her father, who believed that a mind was a mind regardless of the body containing it, and who had supplemented her reading with his own commentary on law, land management, and the behavior of men in authority, much of which she had considered academic until recently. Her father had been a careful man. He had also been, in his final months, a frightened one. She had not known before now what precisely he had feared. She knew now. She would need the document. She could not retrieve what she had not taken, but she could testify to having seen it. And a testimony required a witness, and a witness required someone whose word would carry weight in a room where hers would be assessed against Lady Ashmore's certainty, and Gerald Ashmore's volume, and a forgery she could not prove. The only person whose word would carry weight was the Earl of Torver. And he had just told Lady Ashmore, in a room he believed to be private, that he intended to correct her situation. Cecily unfolded her hands. She looked at the borrowed dress. She thought about what she had to do and in what order. She would need to be very careful. If you find yourself wondering how a woman in a borrowed laundress's dress, with no solicitor and no family and no standing, comes to hold the title to 400 acres in Westmoreland, stay close. The story is not finished yet. The first time anyone at Ashmore Park spoke the dismissive assessment aloud, in those precise words, was at the dinner table 8 days before the council in the butler's pantry, when Cecily had been at Ashmore Park for 11 days and had not yet found the document. Lady Ashmore's niece, Miss Dorothea Rayburn, who wore her pink silk as though it were armor, and who had been visiting for a fortnight with the specific intention of catching the Earl of Torver's attention, had leaned toward her mother at the small end of the table and said, in a voice pitched to be overheard by the 3 footmen and the 8 guests arranged between them. "The companion. She is nothing but a very capable piece of furniture." Cecily had been pouring wine for Mrs. Gough's sister. She had not changed expression. She had registered the line and its pitch and the small, bright pause the table made before recovering its dinner noise, and she had carried the decanter to its next station and had thought, "The woman who says that in that voice has said it before, about other women, and nothing has ever corrected her yet." She was not wrong about the first part. The evening after her morning in the passage, Lord Torver requested that the household's domestic ledgers be made available to him in the library after supper. Lady Ashmore had no grounds to refuse, since he was technically an owner of the mortgaged quarter of the north parcel, a detail of which Cecily was not yet fully aware. Cecily was not present in the library that evening. She was present in the hall outside it for 8 minutes, having walked past the door twice on an errand she had invented, and on the second pass the door had stood open, and she had seen him bent over the ledgers, his coat off, his cravat loosened, his finger tracing a column with the focused attention of a man who had learned to read numbers the way other men learn to read faces. He looked up on her second pass, and their eyes met for the length of a breath. She did not stop walking. She continued to the end of the hall and turned and went upstairs. She sat at her small desk and opened the letter she was meant to be drafting for Lady Ashmore and wrote 3 words and then stopped, because her heart was doing something uncooperative, and she needed it to stop. He had not looked at her the way men looked at companions, which is to say he had not looked through her. He had looked at her the way a careful man looks at something he has been trying to work out and has suddenly made progress on. She did not know what to make of it. She had not had occasion to develop an opinion about being looked at as though she were a puzzle being assembled in someone's private attention, and the opinion she found herself forming, without invitation, was that she did not entirely object to it. She filed the opinion away. She had more pressing matters. In the morning she went back to the library, early, before the household was properly assembled, and found the document still on the desk. Someone had replaced it beside the peerage, in a new position, but open to the same page. She read the second page again carefully, every line, and this time she noticed 3 things she had not noticed before. The first was that the date had been written over, faintly, with a slightly different hand. The second was that the watermark of the paper was from a mill that had not operated in Westmoreland after 1809, which was 4 years before the date the document claimed. The third was a notation in the margin in her father's actual hand. Small and careful. The handwriting she recognized from every letter he had ever sent her, that read simply, "This is not the original." She memorized it. She left it exactly where it was. It is the particular discipline of a woman who has been told her whole life that her intelligence is a courtesy she holds at someone else's pleasure, that she learns to keep it very quiet, and to deploy it only when the deployment will count. The second voicing of the assessment came from Gerald Ashmore himself in the entrance hall 11 days after Cecily's arrival, when Lord Torver had asked after the estate's history in what appeared to be a casual question at breakfast, and Lady Ashmore had said she would have the companion produce the appropriate documents. Gerald Ashmore had added, with the blunt confidence of a man who has never once been asked to moderate his opinions, "She is very capable at documents. That is rather the whole of her use." Lord Torver had not responded. He had turned his attention back to his breakfast in a way that was, Cecily thought from the hall doorway where she had stopped, too deliberate to be indifference. She retrieved the documents Lady Ashmore required. She brought them to the library. Lord Torver was there. He did not look up immediately when she entered. When he did, he said, without prelude, "You have been at Ashmore Park 3 weeks. 19 days, she said. He looked at her steadily. Your father was steward to mine at Torver Hall for 14 years. I know, she said. I was there for 8 of them. Something shifted in his face, small and not quite identifiable, as though a number had resolved into a figure he had been trying to place. He said, "Were you present when my father died?" She had not expected the question. She held the documents in her hands, 2 folded papers and a rolled deed, and she considered the question with its proper weight. "I was in the house," she said. "I was 12. I sat with your father for 1 hour the evening before he died, and I read to him from a book of travels, because he had asked me to, and your household was in considerable disorder, and no one else was available. He fell asleep before I finished the 2nd chapter. I left the book on the side table with a ribbon at the page." Lord Torver was very still. "The book was still there when I left Torver Hall 6 months later," she said. "I noticed it when I came to collect my father's effects." He stood. He was taller than she had registered from the upper landing, and she was not a small woman. And he crossed to where she stood in the middle of the library and took the documents from her hands with a directness that had nothing improper in it and everything purposeful. "Sit down," he said. It was a command. She recognized its shape, the short declarative that expected compliance, and she understood in the same moment that it was not unkind, that beneath its syntax was something closer to concern than authority, and she sat, because her legs were, in fact, not entirely steady. "Tell me what you have seen," he said. She told him. "Not everything. Not yet." She told him about the document and the overwritten date and the watermark and her father's marginal notation. She did not tell him she had memorized the notation verbatim, because that was a piece of information she was keeping close until she understood what shape the correction would need to take. She watched his face as she spoke, and it did not change, which she had already understood to be a sign of attention rather than absence. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, with the same level plainness, "What do you want?" She had not expected to be asked. In her experience, the question of what she wanted had not historically been a question anyone brought to a table where she was present. She straightened in the chair and told him the exact truth. She wanted the land. Her father's land. In his exact acreage. Under her name. Without condition. She wanted it registered correctly. And she wanted whatever had been substituted for the original document to be removed from this house and examined under proper authority. "That will require a solicitor not in Lady Ashmore's employ," he said. "I know," she said. "My father's solicitor is Mr. Hartley in Penrith. I have written to him twice. The letters have not gone." She watched the second shift cross his face. This one larger. This one with something in it that she could only describe as a controlled form of fury. The fury of a man who does not raise his voice because he has never had to. "I will see that the next letter goes," he said. She nodded once. He looked at her with that quality of assembled attention she had noticed from the hall doorway, and this time she was close enough to see that his eyes were a gray that was almost green, and that he was 35 years old at most, and held himself 10 years older. There was something in the set of his shoulders she had seen once before in another man, the specific geometry of a person carrying a weight he has carried so long he has begun to believe it is simply part of his shape. She did not say anything about it. It was not the moment. She rose from the chair and smoothed the good wool she had resumed wearing now that the laundress's dress had served its purpose, and she said formally, "Thank you, my lord." He said, "Cecily." It was her first name. She had not given it to him. It was her name in his mouth, and it landed in the room like a stone in still water, quiet and irreversible, and she did not turn back. She walked to the door and out of it, and did not permit herself to think about it until she was alone. She thought about it for a long time. The letter to Mr. Hartley went the following morning via Lord Torver's man. The reply arrived in 4 days. Cecily read it in the small room on the 3rd floor with the door closed and her hands as steady as she could hold them, which was mostly steady, and when she had read it, she folded it and put it in the inner pocket of her traveling coat and went to find Lord Torver. He was in the stable yard, speaking with his coachman. She waited at the stable door until his business was finished, and then she said, when the coachman had gone, "He has the original." Lord Torver turned. His face did something careful. "My father sent it to Mr. Hartley directly," she said. "In the autumn, before his first decline, with a covering letter naming the circumstances he feared and asking Hartley to hold the document against eventualities. The date is correct. The acreage is 412. The signature is my father's, and it has been witnessed by 2 names I recognize." She stopped. Her voice had done something she had not authorized it to do, a slight thinning, the beginning of something she was not prepared to produce in a stable yard. She stopped it. Lord Torver crossed the yard in 5 strides. He did not touch her. He stood close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him against the autumn cold, and he said, "Lo, are you all right?" "No," she said, which was true. "But I am very much better than I was." He made a sound she could not immediately interpret, a brief exhale that might have been anything, and then he said, "How long have you known the document was forged?" "Since the library, the day I arrived." "You have been in this house for 19 days with that knowledge, and said nothing." "I had nothing to say it with," she said. "A suspicion requires ground to stand on before it becomes an accusation." He was quiet for a moment. The stable behind her smelled of hay and cold leather and the particular animal warmth of horses, and the morning was gray and very still. Then he said, "My father used to say that the most dangerous thing in any house was a woman who knew when to be quiet." He said it in admiration. She looked at him directly. "Did he?" "He did." His voice had altered slightly. Not softer, precisely, but the distance in it had changed. "He was right, I think." She did not answer. The silence between them was a different texture from the library silence, warmer, with something in it she did not name. He spoke first. "I will arrange for Hartley to come here, with the original document, with witnesses, and with the appropriate authority to register the correction before Lady Ashmore can take any further action." He paused. "That will need to be done publicly." "I know," she said. "I would prefer it done privately." "That is the one thing that is not possible. Lady Ashmore will not accept a private correction. She will require a public one." She looked at him steadily. "Then it must be public." There was a pause in which she became aware that he was looking at her in a way she had not yet catalogued, not the assembled puzzle attention of the library, not the controlled fury of the document discussion, but something more direct and less armored, as though the stable yard had briefly removed a permission he ordinarily gave himself to stay behind his own face. She looked away first. In the days that followed, she did not see him often. He was managing correspondence she was not party to, and she was continuing her duties to Lady Ashmore with the same surface competence she had deployed since her arrival: the correct letters at the correct times, the correct household documents retrieved and delivered, the correct silence in rooms where a companion was expected to be quiet. Lady Ashmore did not know, or did not permit herself to know, that anything had changed. Miss Dorothea Rayburn continued to arrange herself at Lord Torver's elbow at every possible occasion, and he continued to be courteous and utterly unresponsive in the particular way of a man who is thinking about something else. Cecily noticed. She did not permit herself to think about what she noticed. She was, however, aware of him in the way she had not been aware of anyone before. A kind of peripheral precision, the knowledge of exactly where he was in any room she entered. The pitch of his voice through a closed door as distinct to her as a key she had learned by touch. She was aware of the moment in the drawing room, 4 days after the stable yard, when he crossed behind her chair on his way to the window, and she felt the air displace, the warmth of his passing reach her neck above her collar, and her hand stilled on the letter she was pretending to read, and she had to focus very deliberately on breathing. He had paused beside her chair for 1 moment longer than transit required. Then he had continued to the window. She looked at the letter and understood. With the same methodical certainty she brought to watermarks and overwritten dates, that something was happening between them that she had not planned for, and that it would require management. She was not entirely sure she wished to manage it. On the morning of the 16th day after the stable yard, a letter arrived for Lady Ashmore from a party whose name Cecily did not recognize, and Lady Ashmore summoned her and told her to arrange the household for a formal tea that afternoon, as she was expecting guests. Cecily arranged the tea. The guests were Lord Torver, Mr. Hartley, the solicitor from Penrith, and a magistrate named Mr. Crofton, who had ridden from Carlisle and who arrived in the entrance hall with the specific economy of motion of a man who has a great deal still to do today. Lady Ashmore, who had been expecting a social call and a rival debutante, came down the stairs and stopped 3 steps from the bottom and looked at the assembled party and at Cecily, standing to one side of the entrance hall in her good wool, with her hands folded and the traveling coat over her arm. And something crossed Lady Ashmore's face in that moment that Cecily had not seen there before. It was not remorse. It was not the specific shame of a woman caught in a wrong. It was the recalculation of a very certain person confronting for the first time arithmetic that does not resolve in her favor. Mr. Hartley had the original document. He had a second document attesting the forgery, prepared by a man whose name Cecily did not recognize, but whose credentials Mr. Hartley summarized in 3 sentences that left no room for counter-argument. Mr. Crofton had the authority to record the correction and to authorize the registration of the original deed in Cecily's name under the correct date. Gerald Ashmore had come in from the garden when the carriage arrived and now stood in the hall doorway with his coat half unbuttoned and his face doing the particular thing of a man who has prepared for a situation that has not materialized. Lord Torver stood to the left of the hall, near the window, with his hands clasped behind him, and the gray-green eyes fixed, not on Lady Ashmore, not on Mr. Crofton, but on Cecily. She felt it before she saw it, the quality of that attention, and she did not look back. Not yet. Lady Ashmore spoke, and her voice was admirably steady. "This is a presumption." "It is a correction," Mr. Hartley said pleasantly. He was a small man with a very large briefcase, and the calm of a solicitor who has been correct before and expects to be correct again. "My late husband had an agreement with Mr. Barrow that predates any document this woman's solicitor may have prepared." "The agreement you are referencing," Mr. Hartley said, "is dated from a mill that ceased operation in 1809. The document I hold is dated correctly, witnessed by 2 living persons who have provided sworn statements, and registered with the Court of Chancery as of 3 days ago. You will find that the court has a copy as well." Lady Ashmore's fan stilled in her hand. "Miss Barrow," Mr. Crofton said in Cecily's direction, "is the sole heir to the Barrow estate, 412 acres in Westmoreland, free and clear, under the terms of her father's will and deed, which are now correctly registered." The drawing-room door was open. Cecily was aware of Mrs. Goff at the far end of the hall, pretending to attend to a vase of late autumn flowers and not doing a convincing job of it. She was aware of a housemaid on the stairs. She was aware of Miss Dorothea Rayburn at the drawing-room door in her pink silk, her expression cycling through several rapid stations before settling on calculation. She was aware of Lord Torver, still at the window. Lady Ashmore turned to look at Cecily. It was a long look, the look of a woman reappraising a valuation she had made very early and very carelessly, and Cecily met it without flinching. "She is nothing but a companion," Lady Ashmore said. She said it in the same voice she had used at the dinner table, the voice of a verdict she expected to be final. "A very capable piece of furniture, as my niece rightly said. She has no standing here." Cecily heard the silence that followed, the particular silence of a room full of people who are deciding what they have just witnessed. Mrs. Goff's hands had stilled on the flower arrangement. The housemaid on the stair had stopped pretending to go anywhere. Lord Torver crossed the hall. He did not hurry. He crossed from the window to where Cecily stood, 5 strides. In the complete silence of a room that had collectively decided to watch, and he stopped beside her and turned to face Lady Ashmore and said, in the level register that never changed, that carried its weight in its plainness rather than its volume, "Miss Barrow is a landowner in her own right, and will be received as such." That was all he said. It was 12 words. It was irrevocable. Lady Ashmore's fan opened and closed. Miss Dorothea Rayburn looked from Lord Torver to Cecily, and back again, and something in her posture understood before her face did. Gerald Ashmore said nothing. He turned and went back through the garden door and pulled it shut behind him. Mr. Crofton produced the document for Cecily's signature. She signed it with the pen Mr. Hartley had brought from Penrith, in her father's house name, her own surname in the hand she had always used, careful and clear. Mr. Hartley witnessed it. Mr. Crofton witnessed it. Mrs. Goff, called from her flower arrangement with a word from Mr. Hartley, witnessed it with the expression of a woman who had been waiting for something to witness for a very long time. When it was done, Lord Torver said quietly, only to her, "Come outside." She went. The estate grounds were cold and very still, the November air carrying the particular quality of English afternoon light that is already thinking about leaving. They walked along the gravel path toward the kitchen garden wall without speaking, and she was aware of him beside her in the careful way she had been aware of him in the stable yard. The warmth and the height and the specific gravity of a man who does not fill space carelessly. "I owe you an explanation," he said, when they had reached the wall. She turned to look at him. "You owe me nothing. My father trusted yours absolutely. Whatever the arrangement between Ashmore and Barrow was constructed to look like, my father knew the original deed existed. He said so to me in the last year of his life, and told me that if anything happened to Barrow, I was to see to his daughter." He paused. He did not specify the mechanism. She watched his face. The gray afternoon light was flat and forgiving, and showed him clearly the lines at the corners of his eyes, the set of a mouth that was more accustomed to resolution than to explanation. "How long have you known?" she asked. "Long enough that coming here was not accidental." She absorbed this. "You came to Ashmore Park for me." "I came," he said, "because a wrong was being done, and the person who could correct it had not yet arrived from Penrith. I came because your father was a good man, and you were 12 years old, and read to my father from a book of travels, and left the ribbon at the page." He stopped. There was something in the silence, then, something that had accumulated across all the days in the library and the stable yard and the hall, all the deliberate noticing and the deliberate not looking, and it pressed against the surface of the moment like a hand against a door. "I came," he said, more quietly, "because I have thought about the ribbon in that book since the morning I found it, and I have not been able to account for the degree to which I have thought about it." Cecily was very still. He looked at her with the assembled attention at full strength, nothing withheld, and said, "I recognize that this is not the appropriate moment." "It is not," she agreed. Her voice was even. Her hands at her sides were not entirely steady. "Nevertheless," he said. "Nevertheless," she said. The gray light lay over the kitchen garden wall and the last of the autumn grass and the small frozen remnants of what had been, in summer, a very fine herb plot. Somewhere in the direction of the house, a door opened and closed. She looked at him for a long time. "My father's land is in Westmoreland," she said at last. 412 acres. A stone farmhouse and a working estate that I know as well as I know anything in the world. I intend to go home to it." "I know," he said. "And I intend," she said more slowly, "to receive visitors when the time is appropriate." Something moved in his face, small and definitive and warm, and she understood for the first time that the composure she had been reading as distance was its opposite. He said, and his voice had shifted to something private and direct. When would the time be appropriate? She considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "Spring," she said, "when the ground is suitable." He nodded once. The same formal agreement he gave to reasonable terms in a reasonable negotiation. And she heard in it everything he was not saying, which was, she thought, its own kind of declaration. She looked at him once more in the cold afternoon light, at the set of his jaw and the gray-green eyes and the slight tension across his shoulders that she now understood to be the geometry of a man standing very still because movement might betray him. She let herself see it clearly. She permitted herself, for the first time and in the full knowledge of what she was permitting, to feel the warmth of it. Then she said, "Good afternoon, my lord," and turned toward the house. His voice reached her before she had gone 4 steps. Quiet and unhurried and absolutely certain. "Cecily." She did not stop walking. She smiled at the kitchen garden wall. The carriage bearing Mr. Crofton and Mr. Hartley departed at 4 o'clock. Lady Ashmore retired to her rooms before supper and did not appear at the table. Miss Dorothea Rayburn was quiet through the meal in the reflective manner of a woman revising a strategy, and she left Ashmore Park the following morning. Gerald Ashmore ate his supper and drank his wine and said very little, which was, Cecily thought, the most sensible thing he had done since her arrival. Cecily ate at the end of the table in the good wool dress and accepted a second serving of the roasted partridge and thought about Westmoreland in the spring, when the light comes back to the fells in that particular way, lateral and gold, and the stone walls catch it on their western faces and hold it for a moment before it goes. She left Ashmore Park 5 days later. She had written, in her last evening there, a brief note to Lord Torver, formally addressed and formally signed, which contained a single additional line after the formal close. The ribbon was from a green sash I wore to a midsummer picnic when I was 10 years old. I always wondered what had become of it. She did not read his reply until she was in the carriage, north on the Carlisle Road, with the fells coming up ahead of her pale and familiar against the winter sky. He had written 3 lines. I have kept it. It is, as you may have guessed, not the only thing I have kept. Spring is a long way off. She folded the letter and put it in the inner pocket of the traveling coat and looked out the carriage window at the road running north and thought about the word kept and about the sentence that had come after it and about the particular weight a careful man gives to words he does not say easily. The farmhouse at the Barrow estate was cold when she arrived, as houses are cold when they have been waiting for the person who belongs in them. The housekeeper, old Mrs. Tarrant, who had kept the place as well as she was able, through the months of the late Mr. Barrow's illness and the weeks of uncertainty that followed, met her at the door with a composure that cost something visible, and then abandoned the composure entirely and held her for a long moment in the hall. Cecily let herself be held. Then she went through the house room by room in the fading winter afternoon, touching the walls, opening the shutters, standing at her father's desk where the papers were still arranged in his specific order, the order of a man who expected to return to them. She found in the top drawer, beneath a folded survey map of the north parcel, a note in his hand she had not seen before, dated from the previous February, which read, "She will manage. She has always managed. I have no concern on that account." She stood at the desk for a long time. She thought of all the things that had been done to ensure she would not manage, and of how each of them had failed, and of the kind of failing that comes not from miscalculation, but from underestimating the person one intends to wrong. She thought of the borrowed dress smelling of starch. She thought of the watermark from a mill that had not operated in 14 years. She thought of a small marginal notation in her father's own handwriting that she had memorized word for word, and that had, in the end, been unnecessary, because the original had been held safely in Penrith all along. Her father had trusted Mr. Hartley. Her father had trusted the Earl of Torver's father. And the Earl of Torver had kept a green ribbon in a book of travels for 11 years. She folded the note and put it in the drawer and placed the survey map back over it, precisely as she had found it. Then she closed the drawer and crossed to the window and looked out at the fields in the last of the afternoon light, which was already nearly gone. The sky above the western fells gone to that pale amber that precedes the cold dark of a December evening. The evening came in quietly over the fells, and Mrs. Tarrant lit the fires and brought supper on a tray, and Cecily sat by the hearth in the parlor with her father's note on the table beside her, and the letter in her coat pocket, and the deed to 412 acres registered under her name in the Court of Chancery, and she felt, for the first time in 40 days, the thing that has no convenient name in the period's formal register, the thing that is simply the absence of fear. Outside, the first snow of the winter was beginning to come down against the stone walls of the farmhouse and the bare fields, soft and without particular urgency, covering the long grass at the field margins and the gravel of the lane and the kitchen garden wall, which would, in spring, when the ground was suitable, need considerable attention. She thought about Westmoreland in the spring. She thought about a man standing at a kitchen garden wall in the gray afternoon light, saying, nevertheless, as though the word had been waiting a long time to be said. She put her father's note away carefully, in the same inner pocket as the letter, and let the fire settle, and stayed. Thank you for staying until the end of Cecily's story. If her father's faith in her moved you, or if the ribbon found its way into your heart, leave a word in the comments below. There are more stories like this one waiting.